Timmins-James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a great honor to rise in this House and represent the people of Timmins-James Bay. The bill we're debating today, Bill C-12, the so-called Drug-Free Prisons Act. I think this is a perfect bill for a Conservative government in the last tired, dying months of its senile reign. It meets the three main criteria of a Conservative crime bill. It has a bogus title, that they're going to somehow create drug-free prisons when their own studies say that they're never going to deal with that. They need to come up with other solutions. Number two, as a classic Conservative bill, it won't change anything. It's a windmill that they're going to run with their fake spears at because the provisions already exist. They're saying that they're going to ensure that the drug tests are brought before the parole board to stop these bad people getting out. Well, the parole board already has those powers. So they're tying up more time in the House of Commons. But, Mr. Speaker, there is a third element that makes it a definitive Conservative crime bill. Because these guys are not tough on crime, they're dumb on crime. It's more wasted money. Did you know, Mr. Speaker, and folks back home, the terrible financial record of this government that will blow money on anything that suits their ideology, like the F-35 that they were going to spend. How much is it? The incredible amounts on the F-35. They spent $122 million on this program already, claiming that they're going to stop the drugs in prison. We're going to get tough on those prisoners. After $122 million, they've come up nada, zero donuts. They haven't delivered on anything. So rather than going back and figuring out what they're doing wrong, they'll just come up with another fake bill with another fake title offering very little. Now, Mr. Speaker, why this is of concern is that this is a government that's ran on their so-called tough on crime agenda with one bill after another without ever coming forward with focused, coherent legislation that, number one, is charter, that can meet the test of the charter. Our present Justice Minister has had more recalls than the Ford Pinto in terms of his legislation. But in the account of the waste of money, it costs Canadian taxpayers about $100,000 a year to incarcerate a prisoner. That's an enormous amount of money that's being wasted in prisons. Now, I'm not to say that we don't need prisons to hold people, but if you're going to spend up to $100,000 a year holding them, we could certainly divert a lot of that money to do smart crime prevention, which is to keep people out of the prison system. The fact that we don't factor in, Mr. Speaker, is the enormous financial and emotional and psychological damage, what happens to our society when someone gets into the system in the first place. So we need to look at where solutions exist, where good grassroots solutions exist, that we can actually find ways to cut the recidivism rates and to make sure that we're pulling people out of the prison system and out of the nightmare of drug addiction and drug trading. I've seen a few really, really good models, Mr. Speaker, at the grassroots of how we could actually be smart on crime. For example, just recently in Timmins, we launched a fentanyl task force. Now, fentanyl has become a major problem. It's replaced what was the OxyContin epidemic, and what I've noticed in many of the communities that had never dealt with opiate addictions before, Oxy became very street available. A lot of people got caught up in Oxy that would not normally have got caught up in Oxy, and it created a market for heroin synthetic opioids. And now with the Oxy market being squeezed off, fentanyl has become the new drug of choice. Fentanyl is extremely, extremely dangerous, Mr. Speaker. It's a patch that is meant to deliver a synthetic heroin over a 3-day period. If you cut it up and smoke it, you might end up getting the full shot in one go, which will stop the heart. I've seen young people who've died from fentanyl. And these are good young people. These were people with their whole lives ahead of them who thought this was a party drug, and it's not. So what we've done in the city of Timmins, like they've done in so many other communities, we started a grassroots response of bringing people together to say, how do we learn from each other? How do we start dealing with the trade in fentanyl? But obviously we need the federal government involved because we need a way of tracking the fentanyl patches. Because it's not simply a matter of someone taking their uncles or their grandmothers patch off them when they're getting cancer treatments. There is a trade that's going on in fentanyl that's much bigger. So The impacts here, Mr. Speaker, is that we have the demand of people who are being brought into the addiction thinking it's a party drug and that this drug can actually kill them. We have to do the public awareness on that. But there's the supply issue, which is if it's a lucrative enough market, then you're going to get into the gangs. Then you're going to get into a very, very illegal trade of people who do need to be put away. But we need a way of tracking them, and we need a way of working with police. So at the grassroots, what we've done in the Timmins area with the fentanyl task force is to try and find ways to come up with smart solutions from the grassroots up so that we are preventing, number one, the casualties, the deaths, the overdoses that are costing our families terrible emotional strains and certainly the medical system and the prison system, but also trying to find a way, and we need the federal government to show some leadership on this, so we can actually track these patches back to source so we can cut off that trade. So that's one important element. I was at a very fascinating conference just this past week in Timmins, Mr. Speaker. Brent Kalinowski, who's from the 27 years on the Prince Albert, Saskatchewan Police Force. And Brent was bringing to Timmins a program that's working very well in North Bay, and it's working in Saskatchewan and some other communities, where you create a community hub. And Brent explained this really well when he talked about the years he spent in policing, where you were going after the bad guys after the fact, after the damage had been done, after the families' lives had been ruined. And at that point, what can you do with these characters except you put them in jail? And you're dealing with enormous costs to the medical system, to the prison system, to families who might never recover if it's an act of violence. And Brent said after 25 years of doing this, he felt there needed to be a smarter way of actually getting people before they get too far into the system. And that's a really important issue, Mr. Speaker. There's nothing soft and mamby-pamby about diverting people out of the prison system. When you put someone into the prison system, you are putting them into a university of humiliation and a university of crime. That's not where we want our graduates coming from. So whoever we can divert from that, we're doing smart grassroots responses. So the hub response that was brought, that they're working very well in North Bay and that they've talked about bringing into Timmins, is where you bring the key organizations together, the school boards, the addiction experts, the police, and you will identify, you don't give the person's name, but you could say, we have a 13-year-old female who overdosed twice and was in the emergency ward. We think that this may be the scene of a need for greater intervention. And the school will say, we've actually had her and she's been missing school 5, 6, 7 days in a row. And then one of the counselors say, we've actually been dealing with her, and what's actually happening is the boyfriend's moved in and it's becoming an abusive situation. So all the little pieces of the puzzle around this hub become identified. We've got a problem here. This could end up flaming into a much more serious condition. So what they do is they actually put a team together and they'll go meet the family. They'll go meet the mother and daughter and say, how can we help? It might seem like an extremely simple solution, and it might seem like it wouldn't work, but it's amazing. They say how quickly people are willing to open their door and say, thank God, come in. Can we make you a coffee? How can we divert our child from this crisis? And it goes all the way up through various issues. You start to see the symptoms in someone who's starting to miss school when they're young, or starting to get in trouble, or starting to appear again and again in the emergency ward. These are people who either become victims of violence, or become victims of crime, or become criminals themselves. And once you've identified someone who had, months and months and months of skipping school, well, I know certain schools will say, okay, we'll just suspend them permanently. So then they're suspended, then they're out there, they're not being helped. Or the emergency ward who just puts them back on the street. We need a smarter way because, Mr. Speaker, if we're going to get them to the prison system and waste $100,000 a year, plus all the other costs that it costs the system, and then we're spending $122 million to stop them doing drugs in prison, there's got to be a smarter way of doing this. And I think that we're seeing some really good grassroots models coming from police, coming from community organizations. And I think that that's where our House of Commons needs to start working to say we can be a lot smarter on crime than always spending the enormous amounts of money after the fact, after it's too late. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.